All right, welcome to the third class of Metal Toad University. Today is going to be focused on CSS, which stands for Cascading Style Sheets. I'm going to go over briefly what we've talked about before. We've talked about different professions, how to learn how a page is served, the different ways or the different routes the information takes to get to your browser, the structure of an HTML file. We went over some basic tools, and we went over a bunch of HTML elements. So now we're going to talk about CSS. So one of the main ideas when you're using CSS that you want to keep in mind is the concept of dry, which stands for don't repeat yourself. That's kind of a basic principle in programming overall. The less you can repeat yourself, the quicker things will go. Cascading in the CSS is really important, and it's something that kind of gets swept away sometimes when people get developing. They tend to start styling each individual element on a page, when really if you set sensible defaults at the top for what you expect things to do and section things or style things generically, you can have those styles apply to many more things than just the one thing that you're looking at. So when you're styling stuff, you want to keep in mind that other things may come in the future that may want to use the same styles. So you're going to want to pay attention to that. I'm going to bring up a document we wrote here at Metal Toad. Suppose this one's mine. It's our CSS standards here. So I'm going to kind of read through this document with you. Some of these are going to be a little advanced, so I may skip over them, and we may come back to them either later today or at a later date. So dry, we just talked about this, and here's a good example. We have a P tag here, which stands for paragraph, and we're telling it to have a font size of 10 pixels. Oh, these lights can't figure out if they want on or off. Down below you see we have a header, and this hashtag means it's an ID, and I can show you what I mean by that. I've got my sample HTML page here. I'm going to do a div, which remember is our generic element. If this was really a header, I'd probably use the HTML5 header tag. But for this purpose, we're going to do this. We're going to give it an ID of header. And let's give it a class of university. Let's see. I'm going to misspell that all the time. Let's do school. I'm going to close that tag off and give it a closing tag. Standard HTML there. So how I would refer to this in CSS is with the pound sign. The pound sign says, find me the element that has the ID of header. If I wanted to reference this a different way, I could make this say school, and the dot right there signifies a class. Now when you're writing CSS, IDs can be used for a lot of things. They're used for anchor tags. We talked about those last week. They can be used a lot in JavaScript. But for the most part, IDs are a little too heavy-handed when you're styling stuff. And I'll talk about that here. Let's skip preprocessors for now. We'll come back here. This is Css Selector Speed. So you'll see some selectors here. ID is the fastest. It says, just find me elements on the page with this ID. Easily the fastest. This is a little slower because we're also looking for a class. And now one thing to keep in mind when your browser is interpreting this is it does this from right to left. So it'll go here first, and then here. That's kind of a little counterintuitive, but it'll make sense after you've worked with it for a bit. After IDs, you have classes. After that, you have tags. Obviously, these are a little slower because it has to actually look for every single tag on the page. And after that, you can get into stuff. This is an attribute selector. So in order this would be targeting a div that looked something like this. Just copy this one for now. has an attribute of title and it equals home. Attribute selectors are really, really slow. Sometimes they can come in handy, but if you're using an attribute selector, chances are you're doing something wrong. Really the only reason to use an attribute selector in this day and age is if you're working with HTML that you don't have control over. If you're working with content management systems and stuff, ooh, thank you very much. Delivery. Content management systems sometimes don't let you modify the HTML that they spit out, so you may have to just deal with what you have. In that case, you may consider using this. And the slowest of all is the star. A star in programming often represents a wildcard. This selector right here matches every single thing on the page. So obviously that's going to be a little slower. This character here, the right arrow, that is saying, that's signifying a child. So this would only find list elements, LIs, that are a direct descendant of a sidebar, an element that has an ID of sidebar. These get really slow because instead of just searching this and then searching this, it has to actually do some logic to figure out what the parent is and stuff. You'll probably use this more than you'll use this, but either way is pretty slow, so we want to try to avoid them if we can. So you may think that you're going to want to use IDs all the time because they're so super quick. The problem is when you start getting into larger projects, you have to start overriding classes that have already been defined. And in order to do that, your selector has to have more points or be more powerful than the selector that previously made that. So let's I'm going to do a style tag here. And of course, we talked about this last week, but normally you would put all your styles in a separate style sheet that you would then call. So let's say we have school. I'm going to give this some really generic properties. We'll give it width 50 pixels. We'll give it a height of 50. I've got some shortcuts here, so don't worry. I don't really type this fast. Do background of blue. And we'll take a look at what that looks like in our browser. And you see this box here. Now, this, you'll notice we gave it 50-50, but we see it doubled because we have two items of the class school. Now, say we wanted to override the content and have that be red. If you were to just use the generic selector of school, it would override the first one. In order to go higher, you need to add something more significant. If you add the ID, it will definitely be higher. We'll change this one to red. Oops. Now, the problem with using this ID is if somebody else wants to come along and they want to override a class and say, let's make another div. We'll also give it the class of school, and let's say this is teacher. Say they want to override this color, but there's no ID there. All of a sudden, they have a problem because there's no way to override that without going higher in the DOM. So then you'll start seeing people add HTML div.school.teacher. Let me talk about this really quickly. The space here signifies that this element is underneath this. No space means that this div actually has the class of school and it has the class of teacher. So you'll start seeing these selectors in your code that just have insane amounts of selectors. This is what we call overqualified, just to try and override this ID. because when they designed CSS, they gave IDs a really, really high point value. After a lot of use, it's kind of been decided that using IDs isn't really the best way to go. So if you do have control over the HTML, and we're going to assume that probably for most of the class here, it's much better off to do a new class. Oops. Sorry, let me turn off my chat here. Go on the Hangout. Gotta go. Bye-bye. File transfer quit. Hi, how's it going?
Good.
Just pull up seat anywhere you want. So now I've overridden this with school and class, and we still get the same effect, but now you see this last one is also able to take effect. And it'll be able to do it much, much simpler. So whenever you can, the best thing to style is a class. There used to be a myth among web developers that adding too many classes to your HTML, they called it classitis, was a bad thing because you just had all this random markup. But really it makes it much, much more efficient to style. So add as many classes as you like to anything. So that's kind of some of the basics working with CSS and how the cascading works. We talked about elements, classes, and IDs, and how they are how they're all differently scored. You can also style everything on a page by using the generic element tag. This has no prefix on it. So this is saying all divs. Let's give it a border of 2 pixels dashed gray. So now it's applying to all. If we were to go back here to the school and try to apply a border here, let's make it 5 pixels solid and blue. We get 5 pixels solid blue. And that's because the class overrides the element. So now we'll talk about some layout techniques with CSS. There are many, many different areas of CSS that we can get into. You can even do a lot of animation with CSS these days. I'm going to touch on that and show a little bit, but we probably won't get too much into some of the esoteric CSS stuff. Keep it simple for you for now. So layout techniques. Let's go ahead and get a little better structure here. I'm actually going to use some actual HTML5 too. So do a header.
Is the header the same as the head tag?
No,
Oh,
it is not.
what does that mean then?
Did you watch the second class?
Yes.
So a header is an HTML5 element that basically is telling the whoever's reading the code or the program that this is a header section. It's treated just like a generic div at this point, but it's more semantic. It has more meaningful value when you're reading the code to use a header tag. A head tag contains all the metadata about an HTML page along with links to CSS and etc. You'll notice I'm not even bothering with the head here. I don't have any meta tags to add. I don't care if it has a title. Obviously, if I was working on something real, I would. So let's do an aside. We'll do a sidebar. And then we'll do a main. Actually, no, I'll take that back. I'm going to do a section here. And then we'll do a footer. And for those of you typing along with me, if you need me to slow down at any point, let me know, and I can just talk about something while you catch up. But I don't type very fast, so that probably won't happen. Okay, header.
What are you using to type in again?
This text editor is called Sublime. Okay. So now we go back. We have, this is the header, sidebar, main content, and footer. Doesn't really look like much for now. So let's start giving them some actual styles. Give this class a header, class of sidebar. Header. Let's make the header go all the way across the page. So we're going to go 100%. This will stretch to fill any screen. We'll make it 100 pixels tall. And I want something a little lighter. This is a hexadecimal representation of a color. To explain this really briefly, hexadecimal means it counts in octals. And these first two characters represent the red, second two represent G, third two represent B for blue. So you can modify these values to get different levels. You know, I happen to know that this is a light gray, but you can always go to your Photoshop, pick your color. Oh, speaking of which, I wanted to mention that Adobe is giving away CS2. Which is great for anybody who has a Windows laptop or a very old Mac. Probably won't work on some of the newer Macs, but it's out there.
What about this?
Nope. Right here, down at the bottom, you see it gives me that hex color. And you can actually play with some of these values and watch the hex values change. See, it's only changing the red value, those first two characters. That. Let's move on here. So we've got our header. We've given it a background. We've given it a height. That should be about good for that. Oops. Save wrong file. There we go. And that puts it 50. Pretty straightforward. So sidebar. Let's say we want the sidebar to be about 200 pixels wide. Wait. This is one of the good reasons to use an actual code editor. Sometimes when you're moving fast, you can just mistype something. It won't even be misspelled. I just used weight instead of width. But my editor knows that this is not right, so it highlights it in white. All right, we're gonna let the height just be what it will right now. I take that back. I'm gonna make it at about 400 pixels high. Oops, let's go to background too. So there's our sidebar right there. Now we want our main content to go right here. We don't really care how much space it takes up. Let's also give this a height of 400. Probably use prettier colors here. Alright, let me go back here. Oops. You'll see I used the wrong selector here. I did color, which affects the text, and not background color. You'll notice when I type background that a lot of different elements come up here. You have regular background, then you have background size, origin, color, clip, position, etc. You can specify most of these, if not all of them, with the background tag and do it in shorthand. And that'll look something like, it's usually used when you're doing images or something. You know, you'll have transparent as the color. You'll have a URL to a file. You'll have it positioned at 50% horizontally, 100% vertically, and no repeat.
Is there a comment for CSS?
Yes, absolutely. The comment for CSS looks like a slash with a star. Now, this is pretty good syntaxed if you're working on a small site. With the advent of mobile design and responsive design, we're trying to create sites that look good on any device, and we have different ways to set different properties at different sizes, but sometimes you only want to overwrite one of those properties and not rewrite the entire background string. So what I've been tending to do these days is actually do every single element individually so that it's easier to overwrite when you need to. All right, we have our header, our sidebar, our main content. Hold on, we've got a comment from one of our online people that the Hangout isn't working. I see people on there, so I'm going to assume it is. So what we need to do is get something next to here. There's essentially two kinds of display types with kind of a hybrid third. There's inline, and that's what you can think of as text. Anything you write in text is going to bump up right next to the thing that's next to it. And there's block. Divs are blocks by default, so they break after each one. So there's break after this, there's break after this. There's a couple ways we can get this main content up to the right. Oops. There's the standard way of floating. So we're going to take this sidebar and we're going to float it left. And what floating does is it takes it out of the normal flow and allows things to go next to it. Floats can get kind of tricky. There are other ways to do it. Floats are generally the best way. But if you have block elements that you need to line up together, another way to do that is to specify them as inline blocks. Really quickly, I'm going to add a list here to our main content. Item 1. Item 2. I'm going to close my unordered list. That's what the UL is. It's really easy to let your code get sloppy. You'll see I'm very strict about my indentations. This doesn't make a big deal when you're working with 50 lines of code. When you're working with 1,000 lines of code, having something like in the wrong, or let's say we had this here and that was indented a little, this one was back. It really gets hard to see the actual structure of your HTML and your code. So you'll see people get downright religious about code formatting, but there's a reason for it. So let's see, we added some list items here. Did I save that? I don't think I did. All right, we have list item 1, list item 2. If we wanted those to go together, even though they're blocks, we could just float them. But rather than doing that, let's go ahead and do this. We're going to change the display. Actually, I'm going to show you how this works in the inspector here. So if we inspect this element, and you'll see this is display list item. I'm going to go in there and change it to inline block. Oops, that changed it for one, not all of them. And that lines them up together. The advantage inline block has over just straight inline is that an inline item only has the height and width of its contents. So if I were to go into this specific LI and give it a height of 50 pixels, background of green, you'll see that there. If this was just inline, it collapses. So inline block is kind of a hybrid that gives you some of the properties of inline and some of the properties of block. Okay. Let's say we wanted this to be at the bottom of the page. We wanted this list to always be at the bottom of the page, no matter where that bottom was. We can go in, we'll go into our UL here. And we're going to change the position of it. We're going to change the position to absolute. This is another way to take something out of the normal flow. And we're going to assign it bottom 0 pixels. There we have our list item down at the bottom here. And that will be at the bottom regardless of what happens on the rest of the page here, because it's relative to the document. Which brings us to the next position, which is position relative. Position relative is a little tricky, and I actually struggle with this at first. When you want something to be relative to another item, you put position relative on the item you want it to be relative to. You don't put position relative on the item that is relative. Does that make sense? So if I were to do position relative on, let's say, main. Can anybody guess where this is going to go?
The main content.
All right, it's going to go right here. Oops. So it makes it relative to this content block. Now you'll see that this also covered up the sidebar. This is just one of those CSS things. A lot of CSS is trial and error. I'd probably have to troubleshoot that a little bit to figure out why I was doing that.
Can you have multiple relative? Like say if you had this relative to something else, or does that never be done pretty much?
No, absolutely. Things can be relative to whatever. I tend to use position relative. I'm trying to think of a good rule for that. Not really. I mean, if you need to use it, just go ahead and use it. One thing about position relative is positioned items can actually have different Z indexes. And what that means is if you think of a normal axis, you have X and Y, vertical and horizontal. Z is the axis that's 3D, that's coming at you. So we can actually change the Z index of this sidebar to 2. And in theory, no dice. Let's give a Z index of 1 to main. Oh, you know what? I realized why this didn't work. You can only give Z indexes to items that have been positioned. So that's another reason to use position relative. Position relative doesn't do anything to the item itself, but it marks it as positioned so that goes over. All right, so we've talked about positioning. We've talked about Z indexes. We've talked about floats. Now, there's also all of these attributes that I'm talking about, I'd say 80% of them probably have some more esoteric properties that we're not really going to touch on. You may get into them at some point. Here's one of them, position fixed. So what this does is fixes it to the actual window itself. Oops. I need some long content here. So those other two items are on top of it, so you can't see the text. But you see that the header's staying there no matter where I scroll. So that's a fixed element as opposed to a relative positioned and an absolutely positioned element. Any questions on layouts? All right.
Generally, when you're putting together any kind of website or something, I'm assuming like you literally work top down. Like when you're setting up the code, like you start with all like the basic building blocks, like your header, like basically everything we just did, and then you actually start adding anything else that's going to be in there, like kind of layered like that.
My preferred method is to get all my content on the page. Everything that I'm going to style on the page right up front. That doesn't always happen. When that doesn't happen, I definitely start with, it's almost like writing a book. You start with an outline, and then you slowly start filling sections in. So yeah, top-down approach, definitely.
Okay.
I suppose I should mention that there's a theory going around right now that we should be designing for mobile first and everybody else second. Mobile first is something that's thrown around a lot. I actually don't subscribe to that. And let me explain why. We're going to do a media query here. So I just wrote a media tag. It says app media, max width 800 pixels. Do a few overrides here. And I'm actually going to use another display type. It's called none. It's pretty straightforward. It removes it from the page. There's also, rather than none, you can use visibility hidden, and that will keep the shape of the element in that page, but hide everything in there. So what I'm telling it is, when the max width of the window is 800 pixels, make the header black, and make the sidebar disappear. So now if we refresh this, sidebar disappears at some point. Let me take off fixed here so we can see that header. Oops, I did color black and not background. So now it's black. If we go larger, sidebar comes back, and the gray comes back. Now, the reason I don't subscribe to the mobile first methodology is that when you're building your content, it's a lot easier to include all the content and hide it than it is to do your mobile content and add stuff for desktop. Normally with mobile experiences, at least when you're working on a fairly simple responsive design, mobile experiences tend to have less functionality, not more, than a desktop. So I feel it's much better to go with the desktop version first and then design to your mobile things, and just do overrides for your mobile. I'm sure there's people who can argue that, but I'd argue back.
If you're having a mobile device, and does your server make the request? Does you make the same number of requests to the elements in the server even if you're not?
It does. Them? Yes. Yes. So there is that concern. However, removing a sidebar or a widget, you're going to have to do processing on the back end to figure that out anyway. And there's really no way for the server to know how big your stuff is. they haven't necessarily solved that problem yet. So for right now, I'm defaulting to hiding content. Definitely. There is going to be a small cost associated with that, but not much. Also, if you're hiding images, they will not load. So you don't have to worry about that extra bandwidth. Speaking of images, let's talk about some images.
So we're talking about hiding stuff. This is if it detects there's a mobile device.
Right here. When the max width of the screen is 800 pixels. I believe an iPhone is 480 or something.
It's 620, I think. Wait, yeah, something like that. I remember.
Now, with media queries, you can also target different devices, different DPIs. Apple's latest iPhone introduced a different DPI, the Retina display. It's very crisp, it's very sharp, but it's caused major pains in my ass right now. Because in order to serve better high quality images, you have to figure out what device they're on and then do that. It's really kind of a hassle right now, and it's something they're actually working on fixing in HTML5. All right, where were images? So the number one way you'll use an image in CSS, I suppose I should have gotten some images here. Let me grab some of my FPO images. I'm just going to throw these into my site folder here that I'm working on. Normally for organizational purposes, you'd put all your images in a separate folder called images. But for this, let's say we want to have Tony right up front and center. Jesus, I can't type that today. So we'll do background image, URL, Tony. Was that a JPEG, PNG? What did I do there? JPEG. Tony.jpg.
Do you have a preference? Or
Of
is
image
there a
formats?
difference? JPEG and PNG.
Yeah, we talked about that.
Oh yeah, I remember that.
Oh no, that picture's huge. So Tony's in there. You just can't see him because the picture's too huge. We'll use another property. Background size, cover. That makes him that makes it actually shrink to the width proportions here. I'm gonna actually remove the, let's make this bigger too so we can see more of Tony. Oh, that was the header, not the. Oops. Alright, there's Tony. So, let's see. I'm going to use a different one, I think. That one's just too big. Alright, we'll use FPO, PNG. Now you'll notice, oops, we still have this, I'm going to get rid of our weird positioning stuff just so we can work on something a little simpler. Okay. So now you see that this image is actually starting over here. That's because the floated content here is actually allowing the element to start there but the content isn't starting until after the float. So to get around that, I'm going to add some margin to this. Margin left, same width as the sidebar, 200 pixels. So this will make it actually start where it should. You also notice that it's repeating. That is by default. You can always tell it to not repeat if you want. That's one of these. That'll just make it show up once. And you can also do things like repeat on the x-axis or the y-axis. So now it's only repeating down. Some things to think about with background images. You can get some great effects with some 1 pixel images. So you can have a lot of times you'll see a nice gradient at the top of a website. These days we do them in CSS, but we used to use a 1 pixel tall image and just repeat it across everything. So it's a way to really cut down on file size.
And what did you call it?
I'm sorry?
Brady?
Oh, a gradient?
A gradient. Okay.
Oh, let me explain what a gradient is.
I know what a gradient.
Does anybody not know what a gradient is? All right, that's easy.
Is that something? Isn't that something you can write into code? Like you have a section and.
You can now, yes. The thing is, the syntax for gradients is constantly being updated and changed because it's kind of a new thing. I've got a little tool here. Lets me select a color on one side, color on another. And now I have my gradient. I can select sizes, directions, stuff like that. But what it really gives me, oops, I forgot I need to change the output back to regular CSS.
Is that section of code?
Yes. So when I copy this,
Nice.
that's how much code you need for a gradient right now.
Oh.
And let me try to explain this. So when a browser company decides to start implementing something new, they'll use what we call a browser prefix. And we talked about this in the first class. There's, kind of 4 major browsers. There's WebKit, which covers both Chrome and Safari. There's Mozilla, which is Firefox. There's O for Opera. And there's MS for Microsoft Internet Explorer. And you'll notice that we have a non-prefix one at the end. That's because at some point in the future, these browsers will stop respecting these old syntax and only use the new one. So it's kind of a way to future-proof for all different browsers. And some of the syntax here, let's go with the latest one because some of these have kind of changed over time. It's saying start at the top with this color, RGB, red, green, blue, and go to this color, red, green, blue. You can do all sorts of weird stuff by specifying different angles and stuff. You can do radial gradients. That's kind of beyond this class right now, so I'm not going to go into it. You'll see this filter. This is an old Microsoft-only syntax. So it has it in there just in case you're on a super old Microsoft browser. And let's see if that worked. It did, but our content is very large. So yeah, that's how you would do a gradient these days. If I didn't have my little tool here, I would find this on another piece of code. I would find this existing somewhere and copy it. I wouldn't try to write this myself.
Or you would repeat an image.
Not anymore. No, because an image is a separate HTTP request to the server, which adds to time, and then the browser has to load that image in. We're talking milliseconds, but that stuff can add up. It's actually quicker for it to just figure out color to color. In fact, it might actually be more processing on the actual client computer, but that's not a big deal compared to the loading time. All right, so those are some sample images. Let's see, I had a couple more notes on images I wanted to go over. Text replacement. A lot of times you'll see images used for links. Rather than write an image tag and do a link around that, what we tend to do these days is do image replacement. And let me explain what that means here. So I'm going to wrap this text up here. We'll give it a div, a class of logo. Continue wrapping that div. After we get through this image stuff, we'll be taking a break too. For anybody getting restless. And I must have my code correct. Alright, so now I'm going to define something in the logo class. I use a dot to specify the class. And I'm going to say background image. We'll use our same actually, let's use different PNG 2. So if we look at that now, we see our background image, which is just pink behind everything. I'm going to get rid of our this border, sorry. So you still have the text there though. So in order to get rid of the text, font size 0. Pretty straightforward. But you'll notice that also disappeared. That's because there's no longer any content holding up that div. So we'd actually have to give it a height. And a width. Spelled width wrong. And we see that image pop through there. So you'll normally see that on stuff like logo is a good example because they'll want their actual site title to show up for search engines. So that, because the search engine doesn't see what we see, it only sees the code. So you need to have stuff like a title to get found by Google. So people, rather than having text that shows their name of their company, they'll use image replacement to replace it with a logo. Another good thing for that is things like image buttons. A lot of times you'll see icons used. That's another reason to use image replacement. And there's also a concept of inline images. Oh no. And what this means is you actually encode the image itself into code right in the CSS. Let me see if I can get this to work right. All right. So now you have all this stuff. You see data, image PNG, base64, and just a lot of random stuff. The advantage this has is that this is actually no longer making another server request for that image. So, no, it's loading everything based on this code right here. This code represents the image that we put in there. Now, granted, I used a special tool to give me this, but this is just a technique you should keep in your back pocket. Obviously, it doesn't work for really giant images. But for really small icons and stuff, if you're not using icon fonts, which we'll get to, an inline image is a really good way to cut down on file size.
What does it look like?
Same. Absolutely the same.
So that represents the pink image in the corner?
Yep. If you were to open up that image in a like text editor or something, you'd see something similar to this.
Okay.
but you know the interpreters know to translate that into an actual image. All right, inline images. All right, so we've gone over images, layout techniques, and some basic stuff. We're gonna go over web fonts. We've kind of actually covered colors too. We're gonna go over web fonts and abstracting classes. I talked about that a little bit. Then I may get into some, I may show off a little CSS animation, show you how that works. And then I'd like to actually start building a site. So we'll take a break now and we'll come back in a bit. Oh, you got a question first?
Can you put that code from the text editor onto like a whiteboard so
Sure.
we can copy it in Google? I think there's some. Isn't there a Google app for? Whiteboards?
Oh, I don't know. I'm just going to do it this way because I know how to do it. All right, so let's see. Where should I do this? I suppose we have a Hangout. I should put it in the Hangout for those folks. Hi, Maylene. Here's the link to what you need. How do I get this to everybody else?
Just post it on the wall.
Yeah, I'll post it on the wall of the.
Oh, right there?
Yep.
Oh, I see. That's the Evernote.
There you go. So now everybody can go get that code that we've been working on. And let's take a break. How's it going? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I thought this would be right up your alley. That's why I wanted you to come. I figured with all of your job frustration you've been having, it'd be good to give you a chance to do some other stuff.
Why am I not getting
You can set it up to. You may not do it out of the box. Yeah, absolutely.
Should I just ask him for the link to the password?
Yeah, actually, he can send you. Yeah. Because that's where all the notes for the class and the videos and stuff go.
Did you catch the note about Photoshop being free right now? For older
No,
Macs?
I didn't. Did you post that this afternoon?
I didn't know. Adobe is giving away CS2,
Yes.
an old version of Photoshop, and I'm pretty sure it'll work on that. That's not an Intel Mac, right?
This one is actually.
Oh, it is.
Yeah.
It may not work on that. Sorry about that.
All mine are Intel. I've got to upgrade them though. I haven't upgraded since.
I have that code in the text editor. And it doesn't have like colors and stuff.
Yeah.
That's because you don't have a fancy text editor like I have. Sublime
Well, I
Text?
downloaded Sublime Text. That's what I thought I'm.
Oh, well, let's take a look.
Working in Sublime Text.
So you just copied and pasted your code in, right?
Yep.
Hit save, close it, and reopen it. So when you started the new document, Sublime Text had no idea what kind of document, so it didn't know what type of syntax formatting to apply.
So did you name it something?
I named it index.html. I'll explain why when everybody's back in here.
Okay.
Is there a log on that?
Oh yeah, it's right under there. Let me move that chair. It's Wildwoods is the Wi-Fi, and Metal Toad Rocks with a 3 as the first E is the password. It's right there. You can see that.
Okay, get my grandpa glasses out.
Oh, pretty.
Hey, you want me to throw it in for you?
pretty.
Oh, yeah, if you want.
Sure.
And then to get it to display in the. Alright.
So
You just go to like Google Chrome or whatever, and then do File, and then open.
there's a couple ways. So now that you reopened it,
Mm-hmm.
your text editor now knows that you're using HTML. See, so it knows how to format it.
Gotcha. Before it was just a random note.
Yep. Can you go back to the file and double click it in your Finder? Oh my god! Your desktop still frustrates me.
Well, yeah, I can imagine.
When I was younger and sharing a computer with my dad, I used to every once in a while just grab everything on the desktop and throw it in a folder. Desktop with a date.
Now, mind you, I often used that. I used that at work, as a matter of fact. A lot of people had file desktops were just useless.
And you did that to them?
I would do that to them. I would just go and put everything in a file and we put it on a common drive.
Cool.
Until they started like limiting the common drives, so then. Well, because, man.
Alright, so double clicking that, so to add an HTML extension,
Yes.
your computer knows to serve that up in a browser. So keep in mind when you want to
Yeah.
actually edit it, you need to open with Sublime or drag it to Sublime or save a project that contains your folder that has all your files in it so you can get to it easily.
Mm-hmm.
Those are kind of things we may talk about later on when we're talking about workflows.
Okay, so theoretically now, if I open make a change in this file here, it'll
Yep.
be dynamically changing in the.
Do I just go to highlight mode, others, and then CSS?
No, go to markup.
HTML.
And HTML, yeah.
Okay.
Now, when you
Do I have to
same
save
thing
it?
that happened to him. If you were to open a new document in your special text editor, paste it in, you're not going to see code highlighting because your text editor didn't open that file, it didn't see the extension, it doesn't know what it's dealing with. So if you were to paste that in, save it, close it, and reopen it, it's very likely that it would
Okay.
find
And then
how
do I
do you
save it
know
as?
that?
spot over here.
What?
Spot at the desk.
Do I save it as CSS or HTML?
HTML.
And how does it know that? Because it's HTML or?
How does it know what?
When you reopen it, how does it recognize it as HTML? Is it because
The extension.
familiar with
The extension of the file.
when you said index.html?
Yep.
Okay, that's why you had it. So you give any file that you save an extension of .html.
These are all great questions that we
Sorry.
should be answering in class. I'll be right back.
I thought it was being dense.
Is there like do you just have to add him on to get the
You can
go
look
to
at,
Hangouts?
you can look at Metal Toad,
There's the
University.
University from
Yeah.
Communities.
the community.
Communities themselves?
I just started this week, or last week.
Hello.
Let's see, are you in? there's a book online called What the Plus by Guy Kawasaki, and it explains, it's like a thorough explanation of Google Plus and all the different features. It's free online, so you can I started reading it the other day. Yeah, I didn't
Never really been back much.
I didn't even know about it. I just clicked the little button that said upgrade.
Thank you.
I'm Steve.
I'm Lewis.
Lewis, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
I don't know what you mean.
Know what Drupal is.
Oh, we'll get there.
Okay.
All right, we've got somebody who's having a little trouble getting on the Hangout, so I'm going to try and see if I can help him out here. There's another chair in here. Hey, Teresa?
Sorry.
Did you get an invite from me? Okay, I'm gonna send you an invite right now. Again. Yeah, unfortunately, I don't know how to troubleshoot that right now. We'll have to work on that later. Okay, well, the recordings will be up. All right, later. Bye. Too bad for her. All right.
There is a whiteboard on Google Plus. I think it's like everybody has to download. All have to be on the hang.
Yeah, I don't want to do that. Save bandwidth. Okay. Everybody about ready to get started again?
Yeah.
Alright, so web fonts. Let's talk about web fonts. In the early days of web development, you had your choice between about 6 fonts because that's all that everybody had on their computer. If you wanted to serve something up that had a fancy font, you made an image out of it. That's just what we did. These days you can use web fonts, and I'll just go to a site here. This is just one of many. Font Squirrel. Now, instead of being an image, it's actually individual letters, actual text. This means that it gets picked up by search engines, screen readers, etc. And there are many, 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 many of them. There are lots that you can pay for, or you can get them from Google or some other free shop. Google has this sweet little interface. It's just google.com/webfonts. And you can, change your preview text. Say you're working on a site and you want to see what it looks like in some different fonts. You can select categories, like say you only want to look at handwriting fonts. And let's pick one. Let's pick one together. This one? Sure. I heard a sure. All right, add to collection. Quick use. We'll just do normal. Kind of cool. Shows you a little impact on your page load. Choose whether you want Latin or Latin extended. This is going to be an America only site for now, so we'll just worry about that. And we'll grab this. And this is a link. We talked about this in the first class. This is how you actually get to things like CSS. And the href here is actually linking to the font server at Google and pulling down this font. So we'll add this to the head section that we're going to add right now. So now that I have a head, I also need to add a body. Remember, body wraps everything else. And now I have to select all this and indent it. Oops. Tanner was in the kitchen and saw a sign we have here that says, write your code as if the person maintaining it is a violent psychopath who knows where you live. And that's really good advice, because eventually if you're working in this industry, somebody else is going to be looking at your code. And that's kind of what we make our names on, is how well we write our code. So if somebody takes a look at your code and it's just spaghetti all over the place, instantly are going to have a lesser opinion of your skills. Not to mention they're going to have a hell of a time figuring it out. Okay, so we added the head. We have our link here. Now we're going to need to add something into our CSS. Font family. Now, I want this to apply everywhere, not just to my classes. So this is an instance where I'm going to use a very generic selector. Body. Fundamental. And so I open that up, and everything switches. Let's get rid of our image replacement here. And I want that header text to be a little bigger. Instead of using div, I'm going to use a proper h1 tag.
Do you remember what the number of that was?
I'm sorry, the number of what?
The number of the font?
I don't understand the question.
They're not numbered. You have to go through and find them.
Oh, I see. Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah, no. I don't remember where it was. Yeah, it doesn't matter what you pick. Oops. Okay, so now we have a much bigger header, and maybe we decide that we don't want it on all our content because that might be overkill, so I'm just going to move it to the header. Now it's applying just to the header. So that's the basics of web font, but we can take it even a step further. Now we can do things like color it. And this is all being done in the browser. It's not calling any images, which is huge for us. Let's give it a text shadow. We're going to go 2 pixels to the right, 2 pixels down, give it a spread of 5 pixels, use a black color. Pretty insane shadow here for text, but that'll work. So these are just a couple of the reasons why you want to use web fonts as opposed to using images. Yeah?
So did you say at one point that that you only had a few fonts available because that's all the fonts that people had on their computers?
Right. So the difference is we're now sending the font along with our HTML.
Oh.
When it calls this, this is kind of a bad representation because it's kind of doing a lot of stuff behind the scenes. Let me open a project here and just show you what I work with. Sure, pop it. Now I have to find them in document, of course. The one that's not open. All right. So this is more accurate of what you would do if you were referencing fonts that were on your system instead of just calling a Google font. I brought up the Google font because it provides a really easy interface for you to add web fonts. You can always download those yourself. And to take it a step further, if we were to go to, let's see, let me use that window here. If we go to Font Squirrel, sorry, let me plug in before I lose power here. been told not to do this before the class next time. You got one there? All right. So if we were to go to Font Squirrel, they have something called an @font face generator, where you can add fonts. So I can add any font that I want here, and it will create the different files that I need to serve to different browsers. Just like everything else, the browsers require different font files depending on which browser it is. And you'll see the little agreement here. Yes, the fonts I'm uploading are legally eligible for web embedding. It's because a lot of font foundries are charging for the license to use your font, their font, on your website. It's a web license. Currently on most browsers, that's unenforceable. The browsers themselves don't do anything. Microsoft, I believe they started at 9. Their file format actually checks licenses. So if you try to use something that you don't actually have a license to and they've blacklisted it, it will simply not work on those browsers. So make sure whatever fonts you are using, you actually have a license for, or they were free to begin with.
And what does not work mean?
They would show a default font, or, let's see, notice this says cursive there. Let's do Courier so we can actually see what this looks like. So, I'm going to demonstrate what this would look like. Essentially, if they didn't have this, it would default to the next one in the list. Oh, I didn't save it. So you see Courier there. If I were to simulate this being taken out, hey, what's going on here? Hey Tom.
Howdy.
Everybody, this is Tom. He's a coworker of mine. He's going to be here to correct me when I screw up. It just defaults to the next in the list. So early on, we do stuff like fancy cursive font that, you know, maybe 10 people out of the thousands who are viewing this will actually have, and they'll have a great experience. Everybody else will get, you know, slightly less fancy. They'll get what's on everybody's computer. There was, yeah, like Verdana, Arial, Courier. Those are like really, really basic fonts that were on every computer. So if you don't have a license to Fundamento, it would display Courier in this case. That make sense?
Yes, and so you can use less code by using standard fonts in some ways too.
Yeah, sure, if you want to. Absolutely. I mean, there is a cost associated with web fonts, so that's definitely something to keep in mind.
Is the cost similar for if you're using a font that's already on your machine as opposed to using a web font? Like, you know, if I was going to use like Franklin Gothic Book, would there be an additional cost associated with using that as opposed to using a web font?
No, in fact, it would be faster since you already have the font. This assumes that you're going to download the font with the web file. So yeah, there's definitely a little more cost. It's pretty small. Okay, now we're going to talk about icon fonts. This is kind of a relatively new thing in front-end world. CSS icons. And the reason this gets really... let's see. The reason this is really important is because these are now vector shapes. And to explain the difference between vector and raster really quickly, raster defines every single pixel. Oh, great. Defines every single pixel in an image. You know, there's different ways it can do that depending on the file format. But what a vector image does is it describes lines and curves rather than each individual pixel. The advantage that vector art has over rasterizing is if we were to look at this Olympic rings, let me see if I can open this in its own window here. Oh, probably not because it's CSS. If we were to open this, this is all CSS. Nothing's being downloaded. There's no call. And if I wanted to, say, zoom this by 10, the edges are still crisp and clean. If you were to do the same thing with a raster image, and I'll just do that really quickly here. So this text here is vector. If I zoom in on it, it's in Photoshop it'll actually show you the pixel representation. But if I were to rasterize it and zoom it, it gets really jagged. So the great thing about CSS icons, let me just go to one I know works here. Is that you have the same advantages of web fonts. Oh, do I have JavaScript disabled? Interesting. Weird. You have the same advantages of using web fonts in that you can style them with CSS. They are infinitely scalable, and that comes into play big time when you're talking about mobile devices. And once you've downloaded the the icon font file, there's no extra cost from the server. So say you're on somebody's site. The first time you visit that page, you're going to download that icon file. Next time you go to a different page, it doesn't matter if they have different icons on that page, you're still not going to download that file again because you already have it. So there's a lot of performance. There's a lot of performance gains by using icon fonts. And, you can also do the cool stuff with CSS, like, color them, animate them, give them shadows, etc. I use a font library that actually lets me apply icons. Let's see, let me go to a test site I have here. It lets me apply icons just by adding a class. I'll show you what that looks like. Oops, I think I have it on this site. Oh, I was wrong. One moment, we'll go to a new one. Granted, it did some other funky stuff there, but it added the icon right to the left of it. And I'll show you what the CSS for that library looks like, just so you can get an idea. Basically, it's saying, here's my font file. Here's how you call it in your CSS. And then it describes, this is some special placement for all those things. And then it simply has all those classes there. So you can just instantiate this library in your code and then call icon bookmark to add a little bookmark to anything. Definitely helpful. But that's going a little too far.
So when they download those icons, is that something that goes into like their temporary internet folder, or is that like okay? So if you wipe out your temp folder, then the next time you went there, you'd have to re-download all that.
Yes.
Okay.
It's very quick though.
Okay.
Yeah, and these are really small files, so it's not necessarily something to worry about. Okay. All right, we've gone through web fonts, icon fonts, abstracting classes. This is kind of an advanced concept, but I really want to go over it. There's some theories that we shouldn't be using things like these really descriptive classes like header. Rather, we should have something that says you want your classes to be really reusable. So we would break out our text shadow, font family, and color. And for example's sake, we'll call it effect. Now we'll take this effect class and we'll apply it to the different things that we want to see. So now, even though I have basically the same amount of code, I'm able to reuse that class. See, this is now red and has the text shadow. So that's how you can abstract things out of one class into multiple classes and make them a lot more reusable. So we wouldn't want everything with that effect to have width and height of that. That's specific to the header. But we may want to reuse that effect other places. So that's kind of the basics of abstraction, and that will make a lot more sense when you start actually working with CSS. And there's actually frameworks out there to help you with that too. Object-oriented CSS is one of those frameworks. So when you're working with these, there's always going to be guides and tutorials to go through it. So let's just take a look at something here. Geez, that's a bad example. Not sure what they're trying to show here. So what this is a framework of classes that already exist that you can then use in your content. So left column, right column, main, body. And boy, these are horrible examples. Let's do a little Googling here. There you go. Introduction to Object-Oriented CSS. That Hangout's killing my computer. So this is CSS very similar to what we were doing. Button, box, widget. What they do is they abstract some of those things out into button, box, widget, and now they have skin. So what they did is they took the things that were duplicated and abstracted that out into its own class that can then be applied to everything. So that's a really good example of abstracting classes to make them more reusable. Okay, let's animate some stuff.
Hell yeah.
Hell yeah. All right, now I am going to use a special selector called hover. So after my header class, I'm going to use a colon and then hover. And I'm going to make the width be 50% when I go over it. Not really sure why I'd want to do that, but I'm going to do it anyway. Up here, I'm going to put a transition. Oops. Since this is kind of new, I'm going to go ahead and use a prefix so I know it'll work. WebKit transition. I'm going to specify width. I'm going to specify 1 second. I'm going to specify linear. Linear simply means it's the curve of the speed of the animation. So if you think about if you have a linear curve, it's going to simply go straight from X to Y. If you have something more on an actual curve, it'll be fast, slow down, then fast. So you can do things like have it slide in really fast, but then slow when it gets up there. Just kind of sit into place. You can create bounce effects, stuff like that. So let's see if I got this right. There you go. I go out, and it goes back. We can increase the speed, make it 0.5 seconds. We can also animate all of the elements that change. Oops, that didn't animate, so it means I did something wrong. I think it's all actually, sorry. Only the width is changing. Let's see if we can change the background color too.
That's cool.
So that's basic animation with CSS right there. You could go farther and, let's see, we put a text shadow on that effect, right? So we're gonna do a selector that is header, hovering, but when we hover over that, we wanna change the effect class. So that's how I would write that selector. When the header, when you roll over the header, it changes this effect. Let's go, yellow's nice and bright. We'll change that to white, which makes it glow. In theory. Oh, I gotta refresh, sorry.
Do you say?
Alright, what am I doing wrong here? Oh, it's because I have my transition only on header. I'd also need my transition effect.
Do you have to hover over the text?
I'm sorry?
Do you hover over the text to do that?
No, because I'm specifying this. It's possible the text shadow may not translate. Oh well. That's what this biz is, trial and error. Let's see, why is this not working for us? I do not know. Well, in the interest of time, I'm not going to troubleshoot this. But we can also animate things like position. So we're going to make it relative so it still stays in the flow. We're going to say the top is at 0. Left is at 0. And let's say when we roll over, we want it to move down a little, 20 pixels. So now you can start to see how you can really achieve some pretty crazy effects with just CSS. Back in the day, we used to have to do this stuff with Flash. Alright, so that's some really basic CSS, and we're actually coming up on 7:41. I think I'm going to go ahead and end the class here with just a Q&A if anybody has any questions, because next week we're going to get into building an actual site and really get into the meat, and I don't really want to start that tonight. Anybody have any questions?
Just, it's great that you're doing this.
Oh, thank you. Oh, so I figured out what I was doing wrong here, by the way. We have header and effect on the same element, and right here I'm telling it that effect is underneath this header because I have a space. Big money, no whammies. All right. So there you go.
So in class 1, you had one of the tools up that had the HTML, the CSS, and the Java all separated. Yeah. And so I was curious about this. What you're doing now is you're writing all the CSS in line with the HTML.
Right.
Is that
normally how I would work? A lot of what you're seeing here is different than how I normally work because I'm trying to really kind of explain it for everybody.
Right.
Oh wow, that's interesting. It kept our stuff from the first class. That's cute. Normally how I'd work is I have a whole hierarchy of files. I'll show you one of my.
That's what I thought. So you abstract out all the CSS and call it, right?
Absolutely. Yep. So let's see. Boy, it's even hard to show you all this. So I have my style all in one file that I then call from the HTML. Oops.
So it's like having a separate JavaScript file if you're using
Absolutely.
JavaScript.
You'll notice I have my JavaScript out. I have my images out. I have my fonts in a separate folder. Really just organization, just keeping things straight. Oh, one thing I do want to cover before we leave is preprocessors. You can actually use programs to write a different style of CSS that then outputs into normal CSS. The one I use is called Sass, which stands for Syntactically Awesome Style Sheets. And you're going to see lots of programming type stuff in here. I'm just going to go through it kind of briefly. I have one SCSS that has these import things. And you'll notice that these line up with the files I have with underscores. This allows me to keep my CSS separated into different files, but only serve one file when it comes down to really serving the file to a client. So within here, I have layout, and you'll see I have my page. And since I'm using a preprocessor, I'm able to actually do this right within the page declaration. It's all nested. Normally you'd have to do a separate entry like that. This is pretty straightforward here, but when we get into something a little more like navigation, you can really start to see where this nesting really comes in handy. So under my header, I have a secondary menu. Under my secondary menu, I have links. When those links are hovered on, these go here. So let's just take, I'm going to do a new file. We'll call it test.scss. Do an @import another test. Oops, I think I'm going to make a new file over here. That adds this here. I'm going to just take some sample code out of one of these. Take this header here. We'll put it into another test.css. And now I have to tell my computer to compile this into actual code. So I have a little program here called Compass that's going to look at whatever folder I tell it to. I think I'm in Puppet, right? I think so. Yeah. And you'll notice I'll get a little notice down here that says it's compiled. Oh, there we go. Cool. So it overwrote the old style here. Did a test here. So now if we go to our CSS folder and look in compiled, we have a test CSS. That doesn't have anything. Let's see what I messed up here. Undefined variable. One of the good things about preprocessors is they will tell you when you have something wrong, which is not something we normally get with just doing stuff here. Let me get rid of some of these. I'm sorry?
You're in the modules one still, or?
Oh, thanks. It's cool. Client won't mind, I'm sure. So another thing that preprocessors give us is the ability to use variables. This can come in very handy if you've been designing a site and the client decides, hey, you know, I'm actually a bigger fan of blue than I am red. Instead of going and changing that in a million places, you can change it in one. There's also a lot of things you can do programmatically with preprocessors. You can take a color and you can say lighten by 30%, and it'll just do all the math rather than you having to figure out which is which. I'm getting little beeps here from my Hangout. I think people may be asking questions here. Come on, computer. Hey, all right. Hello, Jamie. Welcome. Another person with us. Okay, let me finish getting rid of these variables here, just so I can show you the output. Come on, computer. Boy, this Hangout really makes it hang. Oops, undefined mix-ins. You can actually do functions too. I'll get to that. All right, I think this is gonna work. All right. So this actually outputs it in regular CSS. So it took what we had here, which was a little easier to read. This stuff might be kind of tricky to figure out what's going on. Okay, there's this, this, and this. But looking at it here, it makes a lot more logical sense to see it in this hierarchy. So that's one of the big things that preprocessors do for us. Obviously, variables are huge too. Being able to use variables in your CSS is something that programmers have wished for forever. There are also things to help you write CSS. Like there's a, you could do something. There are built-in mix-ins with a lot of programs, so you can do things like @include gradient. And I showed you that nasty gradient code before, but with this you could do something like blue, comma white, and this would output it with all the proper prefixes into your CSS without having to worry about it. Also, if you keep your preprocessors up to date, it will, and you regenerate your CSS, it would add any new syntax that came out since then. So it's really a great way to stay up to date with, so you really don't have to worry about things like browser prefixes. One of these classes, we're going to actually set up all these tools and get these workflows going. If you want to try and install Sass and Compass on your own, give it a whirl, but it does involve some command line stuff, so be warned that it can be a little tricky if you're just starting out. So with that said, I mentioned that we're not going to be supporting Windows. I actually have a coworker here who's going to donate some Linux USB drives for anybody who needs one. What this means is it won't affect your computer at all. You just plug it in, turn on your computer, and choose to boot from the USB drive, and you'll be booting into Linux rather than using Windows.
Can I add one thing on that thing?
Yeah, absolutely.
Were you recommending Ubuntu?
I am, just because I don't know a whole lot of distros.
Ubuntu's really great, and I've also been playing with Mint a lot lately, which is like Ubuntu, and then they take Ubuntu as a starting point, and then they kind of make it almost a little more user-friendly, in my opinion.
Wow, okay.
But all the same, like, if you're trying to do something and you Google Ubuntu, all the same walkthroughs will apply, 'cause it's the same
Right.
underbelly, basically.
Cool. Yeah. You know, Peter mentioned that he had these already, so I think they're probably already Ubuntu.
Probably.
But you know, if you guys want to play around with different Linux distributions, it's
Those are the two I'd recommend, though. Any of the other ones, they tend to get a little hairy.
yeah. So hopefully next week we'll be able to get those USB drives in. Oh, next week we're gonna have a guest speaker, Robbie, who's another coworker here. He's gonna talk about JS, JavaScript, and jQuery. jQuery is a library that sits on top of JavaScript that makes it a lot more easy to use and user-friendly. And JavaScript is essentially how you do all the interaction. Well, obviously you're seeing hover states here in CSS, but JavaScript is how you do most of the interaction on anything past click here to go to a page. You're probably going to need some JavaScript to get the interaction that you want. So he's going to talk about that next week. Just kind of looking forward as we move through the class. I'm going to talk about some Git, which is project management software, and SSH, which is how we talk to our servers. We're going to talk in between here. We're going to set up our workflow. And that's when I'll try to get you guys set up with things like Sass and Compass for your CSS pre-processing. Make sure your text editor is working okay. Make sure you can get into Git and kind of understand that. Some of the Git and command line stuff might be a little tricky at first, and you might just have to power through some of it. It gets much, much more comfortable the more you work with it. After we've set up our workflow, we're actually going to start building a site. And this is actually going to be a real site. bbb.com isn't available, unfortunately. So I'll have to come up with a better domain name. But we're going to build a site for a annual Halloween party that I throw every year. So it should be kind of fun. After that, we'll talk about actually deploying your site to the internet, how to get it hosted, how to make sure the DNS servers, the domain name servers, actually point your server to the right domain name, stuff like that. Once we get that site up and going, we're going to talk about content management systems, which is really how you do almost everything these days. We are a Drupal shop. We do a lot of Drupal. Our business is almost, I'd say, 80% Drupal, maybe. But we're actually going to start with a WordPress site. And we're going to do that because WordPress is in use by many, many people. I think Drupal's up to like 50,000 sites, and WordPress is at like 2 million. Drupal tends to be more of a power tool. You can do a lot of things with it, but it takes a little more configuration. WordPress can be kind of limited, but it's fairly easy to set up. So we're going to start with WordPress, do a really simple blog site. Again, we're doing my sites here because I don't have anything better to do. So if anybody has some fancy site they want to do here, we'll do it. The next one after the WordPress site, we're going to do an actual Drupal site. We'll do a simple portfolio. After we do that simple portfolio, we're actually going to work together to do a Metal Toad University site that is actually useful to us and does things like stores files that we've been working on. We can add a whiteboard application to it. We'll really try to do some tricky stuff in that. There's talk of an actual application later on down the line. My wife is a therapist, and she has an idea for a therapy app, so we might try to flesh that out and see what we can do with that. It's possible we may even take that all the way to the iPhone store and try to deploy it there. We'll see. And after that, I'd like to talk about your individual portfolios, what you guys want to do, and how to really land your first web development job. Sweet.
All right, thanks.
I just want to point out there's this really cool site called Css Zen Garden. I know it's a couple years old, but it takes like the same content and applies. You just click on different types of CSS or different styles, and it just changes everything that you're looking at. But it's the same text and content. It's kind of gets you to the concept of how powerful CSS really is.
That's a great site. And I'm gonna bring that up here. Yeah, was there a question down there?
Yeah, when I first heard about CSS, I was under the impression that it was one way of unifying all of the pages on a website so that they had a similar look all the way,
No dash.
no matter where you click, on each of the pages.
Yeah. So I mean, when we when
And
we
this
were
seems a lot more like micro than that.
Yeah, so when we were just working in HTML, what we would tend to do, or at least what I tended to do, was, just let it sit. It's kind of going crazy here. I would do one page. I'd fully flush it out. I'd copy it, and I'd change stuff in it. I'd copy that and change stuff in it. If I had to make a change to something in the design, I had to make a change to each one of those files individually. So yeah, CSS is definitely a way to... I'm not sure why we're so dead here. Die. Let's just, ooh, I can't kill my browser because you guys are on there. Well, I think Chrome's deciding that we're done. Yeah, anyway, CSS allows you to specify one file that contains all your styles, and then you call that from all your different pages. So you can change it in one place, and it gets applied directly. The cascading kind of came in. The original idea was you could have a generic style sheet for your entire site, and then individual style sheets for different sections. We don't really tend to do that these days, mostly because it's just another file to pull. So it's almost better to have a lot of styles in one folder or one file rather than different styles and different. That's why in the preprocessor, even though I have them all separated out, I have them all compiled to one style sheet. Are we back? No, I don't think we're gonna come back from this.
Yeah, there's no dash. It's just csszengarden.com. It's just kind of a fun to play around with.
Definitely. Let me post that on the wall. Oh, I can't. Oh well.
Have you ever messed around with the Google Developer Web Academy or anything like that?
No, never. Nope. There are some definite great resources when it comes to learning web development. Everything I'm teaching can be found online. There's a great app called Treehouse. They do some good tutorials. There's NetTuts, NETTUTS. They do great tutorials. WebMonkey was huge when I was first getting into it, and it's still around today.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of places for great
Not
tutorials.
necessarily looking for tutorials, just like more help, I guess. Just like additional resources, I guess.
Like kind of in a Q&A format, like
I guess
you would ask a question and get responses.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's definitely great sites for that. I'm not sure that I tend to go to Google for that. There's actually a site called Stack Exchange, and that's entirely what it's devoted to.
Okay.
Ask a question and somebody will answer it.
Okay.
Careful though, if you ask a question that's been asked already, you'll be somebody will let you know.
You.
I know Reddit has a bunch of good subreddits too.
Oh, okay.
That's cool. Yeah, I can't say I've been on there, but Stack Overflow. I'm sorry. You can tell I go there all the time. Great place to get answers. The format of it's kind of nice. So you have the question, and then you have everybody's answers, and then people vote on the different answers. You know, web is very, very democratic, so you can actually see multiple answers to your question and see what kind of got the best votes. So.
I think I have 4 tabs of Stack Overflow open right now.
Right. Used all the time. All right, well, I think Chrome's kicking us out here, so let's call it a night. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.